Keep you waiting, everybody. We have 30 participants, and here this evening is Dr. Rob Wheeler to talk about the land valuation revision. We're taking questions and answers at the end in about 45 minutes time, and I, Lord help us, will be changing the slides. So without more ado, over to Rob.
Right. Let us start with some general history. In 1906, the Liberals swept into power with a massive programme of social expenditure. Old age pensions, health and unemployment insurance, reforms in education and housing. Along with increased naval expenditure, this required extra government revenue. Lloyd George, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, proceeded to raise this revenue in 1909 with what can only be described as a soak the rich budget. The massive increase in death duties is the best known measure, but it also saw the introduction of super tax, the road fund licence, and the duty on petrol. There was also a 20% duty on the increment in land values, and this is what concerns us this evening. It is not too difficult to understand the motivation behind it. If one looked around West London, and that was where MPs tended to do their looking around, one could see aristocratic estates, which had once been agricultural land, being sold for building leases at vastly higher values. Their owners had done little or nothing to bring this about. They merely sat tight while the great wen of London expanded and in due course reached them. That, at least, was the perception. The answer was to set a baseline of 30th of April 1909 and to regard any increase in value after that date as a taxable gain. So it was necessary to record who owned what in 1909 and what it was worth. A valuation office was set up for England and Wales in 1910 with 118 local offices and was charged with doing just this. A Scottish valuation office was set up in 1911. My focus will be on the England and Wales Valuation Office, and in particular on the Lincoln Local Office. As Winterbottom explained in 1934, the OS was expected to assist, and the first thing it was asked for were large-scale maps, 3 copies of each of the 25-inch sheets and 2 copies of everything else. The Valuation Office then complained that the maps were out of date, as though it had supposed that every sheet benefited from an annual revision. This led to almost all available staff being diverted to emergency revision. As regards what was to be revised, it was agreed that this was left entirely to the Valuation Office, which in retrospect was a very unfortunate decision. The original idea was that the new detail surveyed, typically housing development, would be traced onto a blue plate and overprinted on the existing sales edition. The resulting 2-colour map would therefore show superseded detail like field boundaries, but you might suppose the Valuation Office would find this useful as it might relate to ownership in 1909. Producing a short run of such maps would be relatively cheap, but if the changes were small, it might be cheaper still to supply 2 manuscript copies instead. The Valuation Office decided it didn't like the idea of maps showing superseded detail. It wanted proper revised sheets with old detail deleted and new detail printed in black. I don't know how many new sheets were printed in the 2-colour form, but I've never seen one. Meanwhile, The Valuation Office had not been sitting on its hands. It had recruited its own surveyors. Those working for the Lincoln office have clearly been trained by OS. Perhaps they'd recently retired, or perhaps they'd been poached, attracted by the prospect of not having to move around, and perhaps by better pay. Next, please. Here we see the work of one of them, showing a new street in suburban Lincoln, on the site of Pennell's nursery. The superseded detail here is unusually complicated, but that doesn't seem to have been considered a problem, at least not in Lincoln. The Valuation Office surveyors never went through the troublesome process of deleting old detail from the printed map, and their additions, when carefully drawn, are always in red. We can date this work by comparison with street directories to late 1910. Next, please. The Valuation Office wanted to divide everything up into what are called hereditaments, based on common ownership and occupation. Each hereditament was assigned a number, and space for writing the numbers might be a problem. Often the use of a 1 to 500 sheet, as here, provided a solution. But ignore those colourful hereditaments for the moment and concentrate on the survey work in red. Note the bay windows. Note the carefully drawn gates from the back alley into each yard. Here we have a surveyor who likes to do a good job, and he has been prevented from doing anything like this by the simplified specifications introduced by the OS in 1892. So we have a survey with more detail than anything the OS would have undertaken at this date. Incidentally, note that some houses have diagonal hatching, others don't. I think this may be to distinguish completed houses from those not yet roofed. The principle remained that if it was cheaper to deliver 2 manuscript copies than a new printed edition, the OS would supply 2 manuscript copies. Now that the printed option had been made so much more expensive, there needed to be an awful lot of amendments before the manuscript option became the more expensive one. In fact, no printed editions whatsoever were supplied to the Lincoln office. All the updates were supplied in manuscript.
Sorry.
So here we have an extract from one of those updates. The base map is the previous edition of 1906. Houses have been laid out in what had been the premises of a brickworks. They're actually drawn in blue, but the colour hasn't come out all that well. The draftsmanship is really neat, so much so that when I first saw these sheets, I really wondered whether I was looking at a printed blue plate. One other sign that this is OS work is the area bracing and a new parcel number 100A. After some initial doubt, the Valuation Office decided it wanted area information on all its updates, although I haven't encountered an example where it actually used this information. But the main way of seeing that this is an OS product is the heading added, again in this shade of blue that has come out as grey. The note Areas Revised is also in blue. This would be really useful if it told us which parts of the sheet had been revised. You might suppose that even the Valuation Office might find the negative information that something hadn't been developed by 1911 as potentially useful. Sadly, all it tells us is that the area computation branch has provided its pennyworth. But look, here is another specimen of the same sheet. The previous one had partial revision 1911. This one has partial revision 1911 and 1912. What is more, the and 1912 had clearly been added. If we look at the houses in the brickworks, we find there are a lot more of them. Parcel 100A has almost doubled in area, and most of the brickwork buildings have gone. What I mean by this is that they have been deleted. It's terribly good deletion, albeit not quite perfect. There was a minor adjunct which has gone, but a bit of its hatching is faintly visible. And that's why I included the enlargement on the right, where I think you can see a bit of, oh yes, it's the bit right next to the tramway, where before there was a little square building, and the little square building has gone, but they haven't quite deleted one of the hatching lines, or the only hatching line. You may be tempted to say, looking at this, the bulk of the brickwork buildings were pulled down between 1911 and 1912. That is a temptation that must be resisted. The revisers were instructed to limit their attentions to areas and categories that the Valuation Office asked for, and the Valuation Office was usually interested in houses. The buildings were deleted because they got in the way of the houses. Newspaper reports suggest that the demolition actually took place in 1910. But the revisers clearly took the view that now that they are obliged to delete buildings to clear the map, they have a duty to establish what is still there, because otherwise they might present a false picture. So the depiction of what remains at the head of the tramway is probably an accurate depiction of what was there at the time of the 1912 revision. So let me ram this home. We actually have two land valuation revisions of this sheet, one to 1911 and a second one to 1912. The Valuation Office needed to establish what was there in 1909 and what it was worth. Why a 1912 update should be any use to it, given that it already had a 1911 picture, is a mystery to me. It was probably a mystery to the revisers, but their instructions were simply to do what they were told. Just about all the Lincoln sheets went through this process of two revisions. So does that mean I can exhibit slides like this pair for most of Lincoln? Well, no, because the drawing office wasn't so complacent. They were contracted to provide 2 manuscript copies of every updated sheet. They had provided 2 copies back in 1911. That was all the Valuation Office was getting. Perhaps by way of a compromise, they accepted that if the revisers had done a bit more revision, they were duty-bound to draw that extra revision. But they weren't going to draw the 1911 work again. So the process followed was that the Valuation Office handed back the sheets they'd been given in 1911, and the draftsman added the extra updates. Hence, for everywhere else, what we have is just the map with revisions of 1911 and 1912. So how did the sheet on the slide here on the left come about? Possibly the Valuation Office claimed to have lost one of the 1911 sheets, and the Drawing Office made an exception. But it's only one copy. The other 1911 copy appears to have been returned to the OS for updating. There is one further quirk of these revisions. In some cases, the revisers were allowed to recognize the existence of new construction. This, that is to say, recognizing the existence of new construction, was done by typing, i.e. stamping, a simple description followed by either one building or several buildings. So there's a school in that area, but just what shape it is or anything like that, we're not going to be told. It is now time to introduce the third product the Valuation Office requested. As already explained, they needed space to write in hereditament numbers. If there was a 1 to 500 map, they could use that. The topography might be badly out of date, but their own surveyors could take a more modern 25-inch and enlarge the detail fivefold. The 1 to 500 was not always available, so they asked OS for photographic enlargements of the 25-inch to the 50-inch scale, or to be precise, 1 to 1250. And even when the 1 to 500 was available, it was often more convenient to use the 50-inch scale and to have the enlargement done photographically. They asked for 8,000 such sheets, though only 3,000 odd had been supplied by the end of 1912. They're the same size as the 25-inch sheets, so each covers a quarter of a 25-inch sheet, numbered by the addition of northwest, etc., to the sheet number. The early products are simple enlargements of the sales editions, so not much use to historians. In fact, some of the sheets requested seem to have had little in the way of fine detail and seem quite unnecessary. But later on, we get photo enlargements of sheets benefiting from partial revision. The style of these is surprisingly variable. Sometimes buildings have diagonal hatching, but some don't. And different quarters of the same 25-inch sheet can differ. Where we have a 50-inch enlargement of a 25-inch supplied in manuscript, the question arises of what was photographed. Was one of the manuscripts photographed prior to its being passed to the Valuation Office? Or were there field documents that were respectable enough to photograph? I would argue that the Lincoln 50-inch sheets are from field documents because they lack any new names. Such names had perhaps been written in blue pencil, which would not photograph, leaving the stamping to be done by the drawing office. Sometimes it is a challenge to work out what is going on. Here on the right, we have the manuscript update of Links 70.11, marked up with manuscript editions, which are actually in blue, though they don't the color doesn't stand out all that well, but they're distinguishable by not having hatching. The editions are recognizable, yes, because they're not hatched. On the left, we have sheet 70.11 Northwest, the 50-inch. The new editions here are neither shaded nor hatched. Ignore the pencil markings and the hereditament numbers, which have been applied by the Valuation Office. Just look at the black. Much of the block adjoining the high street, i.e. that outlined in green, and the properties just north of it, much of this has been deleted and redrawn. The word schools has gone, along with much hatching. If you just compare the two sheets, you see some very small differences, but wonder what is going on. The key is to understand that the streets north and south of this block outlined in green are new. The northern one has been cut at an angle through the existing properties, and redrawing most of this block seems to have been the surveyor's response. If you just compare the two maps, you might wonder why he has deleted the word schools. The answer is that on the previous edition, it was placed to the east of the schools where houses are now. So the reviser has deleted the word in order to draw the houses. For the manuscript update supplied to the Valuation Office, the word has been inserted in the only convenient place. But as I explained, the stamping of new lettering was not possible in the field. Incidentally, the word on the manuscript is typed in black. There is a definite convention here. The name of a new feature would be in blue, but an existing name which has merely been moved is in black. The observant may notice a couple of small buildings that differ between the two maps. I could not throw any more light on these, so looked elsewhere. Now here we have new terraced houses on a street called Bargate, which was actually the southern gate of the medieval city. Like a lot of contemporary developments, plots were bought in small groups by local builders. Each builder provided an alleyway giving access to the back gardens of his houses. Look at the white houses on the left-hand map. The easternmost tunnel entrance gives access for two houses to its left and two houses to its right. I say the easternmost tunnel entrance, the only tunnel entrance you can see. But what about the third house to the right, which is also in white, and so also is new? What was the access to that? Well, nothing is shown. But if you look at the manuscript copy supplied to the Valuation Office, you see that the alley has been extended to provide that access. Not only is this logical, but it is confirmed by the 1930 version of the sales edition. So an error on what we believe to be the original survey appears to have been corrected in the drawing office. I think that what is happening here is that there was some form of checking process whose results were incorporated on the manuscript map, but not on the field documents which were photographed. The 1 to 1250 here bears the marginal note partial revision in 1912. In view of this, I'm inclined to suppose that, like the manuscript, it incorporates the results of both the 1911 and the 1912 revisions. But many of these sheets claim a partial revision date of 1911. So these presumably record the results of the 1911 revision, which we cannot find on the manuscript copies. It would be good to check this. Unfortunately, we only have two Lincoln sheets where a manuscript with just the 1911 revision can be seen. One I've shown you already, and there is no 50-inch enlargement for that sheet. The other only saw a 1911 revision, and that too has no 50-inch enlargement. So I can't make this comparison in Lincoln. Fortunately, Grantham comes to the rescue in an unexpected way. Here, the blue ink of the manuscript does at least look blue, but it can be a very pale blue or a more purpley colour. More careful inspection shows that we have different inks here. There is the over-diluted ink, which I postulate was used by the draftsman making editions in 1911. And if you look at that word new and go south from those are, I believe, editions of 1911. And then there's the rather fierce ink used by the draftsman in 1912 when the sheets had been returned for updating. Those houses north from that word new. And then there is the ink in the ink pad used when names were typed, and I do not claim to be able to distinguish 1911 names from 1912 names on this basis. What supports my hypothesis is that the additions seen on the 1 to 1250 correspond to the additions in the pale ink on the manuscript. You will see that St. Anne's Church is drawn in dark blue. So you might be tempted to assume it was built between 1911 and 1912. After all, the 1911 reviser must have walked back and forth between the terrace of houses to its south and the light blue terrace on the other side of the road to the north. Well, you'd be wrong. The 1911 reviser seems to have had the job of updating houses, and the House of God did not count. So why did it appear in 1912? Possibly because being right next to houses that were being added, it was deemed to affect their valuation. The church, by the way, had replaced the tin tabernacle just down the road. You should be able to see it there. Yes, by the O of road, you will see something marked church. There is even a picture of it on the map. There we are. This was apparently shipped off to Manchester for use there, but neither reviser felt it was within their remit to delete it from the map. Now, Charles Close was appointed Director General in August 1911, whereas Grant, his predecessor, seems to have spinelessly agreed to every half-baked proposal by the Valuation Office. Close seems to have tried to salvage something at least from this frightful diversion of effort, and that something was the 50-inch. Historians tend to turn their noses up at the 50-inch, especially the sheets that were just photo enlargements of sales editions. So it is worth observing that a lot of official customers were very attached to the 1:500, despite its outdatedness. It was a good scale for a municipal engineer setting out street improvements. I've seen a Lincoln sheet used in this way, where the engineer's staff has updated detail from a later edition of the 25-inch on the 1:500. I don't think the Lincoln engineer ever used a 50-inch in this way, but the rating people did indeed use a set. They wanted extra space to write in details, and they needed it in the outer area that wasn't covered by the 1:500. Private landlords also found the series useful. Cambridge has some sheets from such a source. There's an interesting note in Winterbottom's large-scale chronology, as you see it there. This shows how seriously the new scale was being taken, at least at that date. We don't need that one yet. Although I find I cannot distinguish the change that Winterbottom describes. Winterbottom tells us that 8,000 550-inch sheets were demanded in 1911, though by the end of 1912 only 3,063 had been supplied. Publications stopped at the end of 1913 with just a few sheets bearing a 1914 date. A cursory inspection of the Bodleian's list suggests that the number of 1913 sheets did not exceed 1,000 or 1,500 at most, so I presume that most of the programme was cut short. However, small numbers of straight photo enlargements continued to be produced, I suspect with subventions from local authorities. For example, the Eastbourne sheets were reissued in 1925 when a new revision of the 25-inch appeared, and 5 sheets were reissued yet again in 1931 when there was yet another revision. The chronology tells us that the instruction about finer drawing of the 25-inch sheets was countermanded in 1926, which is perhaps a slow reaction given that publication of the 50-inch had virtually stopped. Winterbottom's 1934 paper implies the series was defunct. The 1933 Eastbourne sheets seem to have been a last gasp, almost as though a request from the local authority took the OS by surprise and they realised they were still officially offering the service. I would like to know more about Messrs. Cook, Hammond and Kell's offerings. By 1945, they were reproducing 25-inch sheets for local authorities, either at the true scale, or at 1:1250, or at 1:500, as requested. And they would do this either with the sheet as published, or with the local authority's own updates, and on a robust cloth backing as well. If they were offering the service by 1934, it would be logical for the OS to withdraw its own enlargements, not least because it was nervous about the practice of printing maps that incorporated local authority updates. I think it was afraid it would be blamed for errors made by other people. The Valuation Office proved unable to carry out the task it had been given. Part of the problem was that the Finance Act defined site value as gross value less value of buildings less timber and fruit trees. It no doubt sounded logical to a parliamentary draftsman, and it could be made to work with agricultural and housing land. But for industrial sites, it broke down. Take, for example, the coal yard next to St Pancras Station. There wasn't a market in railway coal yards. The valuers can't point to one at Brixton sold by the South Eastern and Chatham to the Midland Railway. You can perhaps value the Midland Railway's coal business separately from the passenger and from other goods, but you can't really attribute that value to particular sites. This matters because potentially a far-seeing officer in the railway's legal department may speculate that at some time in the future, a major London institution like the British Library might be looking for a new site, and the railway might be able to get a good price for its coal yard. It will be liable to pay Lloyd George's tax on the incremental value. It is therefore important that the value attributed to it in 1909 should be as high as possible. I suspect there were quite a lot of disputes of that nature, and with the prospect of lots of lawsuits, the government decided in 1920 to scrap the tax. It didn't scrap the Valuation Office, which found other jobs to justify its continued existence. The Valuation Office retained its incomplete 1909 valuation, known to historians as the Lloyd George Doomsday. This consisted primarily of the valuation registers and a set of definitive index maps, which generally bore a stamp not to be taken out of the office. The other maps were retained as working papers. In 1979, it was agreed that the valuation registers should be transferred to local record offices. The definitive index maps went to TNA. The other maps were, I believe, offered to the local record offices. What was wanted in the index maps was clarity. If the OS had produced a new printed partial revision, I imagine that was used, and the 50-inch sheets were quite widely used. The manuscript updates are sometimes used, but there was a tendency to regard them as too cluttered, and they often bore a lot of annotations made by the valuers. So if you're interested in what maps were produced, your local record office is quite likely to have more of them than TNA. So the position we've got is that for the 50-inch, we know the extent of the mapping, at least we think we do, from the Bodleian's list. For the 25-inch, but we don't know how they were produced. For the 25-inch manuscript sheets, we know the process, but we're not sure how many exist. And for the 25-inch printed sheets, we can presume on the process, but again, we've got no idea how many were produced. A caveat, a big caveat. This is based on the Lincoln local office with access to some low-resolution images of Nottinghamshire. Not everywhere was the same. Many of the 1 to 500 sheets from Newton Montgomeryshire are available on the National Library of Wales website in a set which appears to be the definitive index map of hereditaments in the urban area. Here we have a fairly typical example. I've included it because we have areas common to multiple hereditaments. Perhaps this shows a difference in local conveyancing practice, with the Lincoln solicitors preferring to treat the same requirements via easements. But on these sheets, we have amendments in purplish blue on the 1 to 500. There's nothing in Winterbottom's account to suggest that manuscript amendments of a 1 to 500 were ever supplied by the OS. And there are none of the headings that would tell us that this is an OS product. What is more, the drawing isn't of the standard seen in the OS's Lincolnshire work. I deduce that this is the work of a Valuation Office surveyor. Either he's drawing in blue because this is an enlargement of detail added by the OS at the 25-inch scale, or he is using blue because everyone knows that the OS editions in blue are only found at the 25-inch scale, or the view in Montgomeryshire is that this is an entirely different colour from the OS blue, and we know that Welsh colour perception can be different. I have no idea which of these is the true answer, if any. I cite it as a warning that Lincolnshire may not be representative of the whole of the UK. Now, acknowledgements are due to the British Horse Society for information about TNA index maps. They've been using the Lloyd George Doomsday as a source of information on rights of way, which might be indicated by an adjustment of site value. And Lincolnshire Archives have put all their maps from the Valuation Office online. For careful comparison of different sheets, this is so much more useful than ordering up the sheets and looking at them side by side. But you do need to know exactly what the reference is in order to get anywhere with this. 6-tax space maps. So, thank you very much. I hope that was comprehensible and interesting.
Oliver has raised his hand. Richard, take it away.
Thank you. I've actually got 3 points. I don't know whether Rob would like me to give him all 3 of them at once, or whether he'd like to have them singly.
He will tell you.
Let's have them singly.
Okay. What's your source for the 2-colour proposal? Is it in
Winterbottom?
It's in the national plans, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. So that also includes the recruitment by the Land Valuation Office of its own surveyors.
No, that doesn't. He doesn't say much about the Land Valuation Office, but it's clear that those things in red are not drawn by the Ordnance Survey, and therefore they must be drawn by Valuation Office surveyors.
You're right, because the whole of this land valuation business has struck me as one of the less well documented episodes in OS history. Leading on to the third point, which is Eastbourne, it's evident, I think, from Winterbottom in 1934 that Eastbourne was an area of compulsory land registration from early on, and also for continuous revision, which will explain why it seems to be having rather frequent editions at a time when the OS were rather up against it in the late 1920s, early 1930s.
Right, so that explains why the 25-inch was being updated.
Yes.
It might be, of course, that it was the land registry that was requesting the 50-inch, but no, because the land registry got its own special enlargements done by specialist OS staff, didn't it?
Certainly, lastly, I don't know what the procedure was around 1930. More recently, it's tended to use the 1 to 1250 scale quite extensively, and not just in areas which were covered by the OS 1 to 1250.
So it is possible then that it was the land registry that was paying for these enlargements. But in that case, you would have expected that they might carry on paying, and they might continue to be produced. Or maybe they did continue to be produced, but they only went to the land registry, because the fact that the Bodleians got these 1932 ones does seem to indicate that they were put on public sale.
Yeah, there is actually another very shadowy land valuation episode around 1930-31, which Jeff Armitage referred to in a sheet line somewhere around sheet lines 27, 28 or so, or 28, 29, early in my editorship of sheet lines, it's been probably late 1990, of some valuation exercise which was set up then, which was then aborted. But it might explain one very puzzling thing, which is that the town of Skegness wasn't, as far as I'm aware, updated after about between 1905 1 to 2500, between about 1905 and the resurvey at 1 to 1250 in the mid 1960s. Yet the 1-inch popular edition, I think the 1934 printing of sheet 48 has some revision on the north side of the central part of Skegness, North St Matthew's Church. And the only source I can think of this to supply this would be this possible revision of around 1931 for some sort of land valuation purposes.
There are some papers associated with the later land valuation in Lincolnshire archives, but not very many.
No.
And there are certainly no maps.
No. But apparently if something like 150 maps were produced as a result of the circa 1930 exercise, I think.
Right.
That sounded a comprehensive answer.
Yes.
Happy with that, Richard?
Yes, certainly.
Jolly good. Thank you very much. Does anyone else like to ask a question?
Yes, Ian. Ian Mitchell.
Ian, take it away.
In the title, you said it a wasted year. I wasn't quite clear why it was a wasted year or what was wasted, really.
Oh, possibly I should have made it clearer. I did say that almost all available staff were transferred to this emergency revision. So all normal revision ceased and work was done which was of a standard which meant that it couldn't be reused. So essentially it had to be all redone when the areas came up for revision later on.
All right. And of course, any later work was interrupted by the war, I expect, as well.
Well, yes.
Went to the front, or mapping trenches.
That sounded like a firm yes, Ian. So thank you for your question. Does that answer it? Good. Okay. Thank you. Anyone else?
Nick Woods, I've got a question.
Nick.
Thanks. Yeah, I've looked at some of the specially revised maps at the National Archives for Dorset, and the area I'm looking at is a kind of country estate. And in blue, you can see lots of additional survey trees added, which I assume meant when they were revised for the Valuation Act, they actually went to enough detail that they marked individual trees that have been added to the landscape.
Wow, that's remarkable. I mean, I did say that the rule was that the local valuation office requested whatever it wanted, and presumably it said that it wanted a thorough valuation or a thorough map of the estate. Of course, those trees would be timber trees, so would be taken into account in the valuation, but you don't need to depict them. It will be quite sufficient for the valuer to walk around and tot them up and say, yes, basically there are 34 trees there, which on average are worth £5, 10 shillings each.
Yeah. So would those trees, would they have been added by an OS surveyor or?
They're in blue, are they?
Yes.
On a map that says revised for the purposes of that heading I showed earlier.
Yes, revised for inland revenue purposes.
Yes. Well, yes, they must have been added by the OS surveyor in that case.
Okay. Because it just seems an incredible amount of detail. I mean, it's very useful for me because it highlights the changes in the landscape quite clearly.
And those trees generally continue in the same positions on the next full edition, or is there not a next full edition if in rural?
Yeah, in later editions, though, by and large, those features are still are included in the next sort of proper OS edition.
Yes. Well, I think there's no doubt that that is a pucker OS revision, and it may be that that's a case where the OS was happy to use the work of the land valuation revision as a base for later revision. I was, when I said it couldn't be used, I was thinking of some Scottish examples where it's quite clear that the standard of positional accuracy of some things was not what it should have been.
Okay, yeah. I mean, these look quite accurate as far as I can tell.
Right.
Thank you, Nick. Fascinating. Okay. Fascinating. I wonder what that value of each tree really was.
I don't know. I haven't seen any. You sometimes see this sort of thing in pencil notes on the working sheets. So I do know how they calculated the value of greenhouses. You know, they had a sort of standard figure per linear yard, depending on the cross section of the greenhouse. This is for commercial greenhouses.
Oh,
you can see the calculation.
Nick, do you know what species of trees these were?
I mean, obviously the OS distinguished between broadleaves and conifers.
Yeah.
I suspect some are probably oak, some are probably Scots pine, judging by what's there now. But there's, I mean, probably within the sheet I'm looking at, you know, a couple of dozen trees added, plus other quite small features as well.
Fascinating. And this is around which bit of Dorset?
This is in Upton House in Dorset on the edge of Poole.
Oh, right.
And it's really quite unusual to have manuscript revision of rural areas like this. All the Lincolnshire manuscript revisions are of urban areas.
Yeah, because I would have thought that that's where the big change in values were, really, all the development was. I mean, in this particular case, a guy had bought the estate in about 1901 and obviously done a lot of work on the estate. Because I wonder, you know, what would happen when the OS turned up to resurvey his land so he could pay more tax. But of course, he would want the initial valuation to be as high as possible.
Yes.
So if you planted a lot of trees,
that could
he
be
would want that mark.
It could be the reason. It could be that the Land Valuation Office thought it had a lawsuit on its hands and therefore wanted to make sure that its evidence was as firm and rigorous as possible.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nick. Fascinating. Jonathan Robert, is that your hand waving?
Thank you. It's a stimulus from this discussion between Nick and Rob. I live down in Somerset near Frome, and I've actually been to the National Archives and dug out the entire data set for my village and for a neighbouring one where I happen to be the Lord of the Manor. I found the mapping, frankly, difficult to make a huge amount of sense of. I was particularly, however, interested in the reference books which are available at the National Archives. And each hereditament, each reference, not in my area at any rate, there are 4 pages given to written up, sometimes in manuscript, by the individual surveyor for each property, including if it's housing. There's a vast amount of detail, how many outside privies and other interesting details, the site valuation and so forth. I would have thought that in the case of the trees, indeed, they're either timber or fruit trees, however you choose to value them, but that was clearly a Valuation Office process. Therefore, I would be interested to know how much, in general, Rob has found it helpful to look at the individual reference books and the site write-up for each or multiple hereditaments in order to be able to make further judgments in in respect of mapping, but in broad terms, I actually genuinely have found the reference books to be of huge doomsday type value for the entire understanding of what was the situation in the village where I happen to live back then, which is over 100 years ago, and it may be of wider use to other people.
Well, that's really interesting to hear from you on that. What I've been doing has almost entirely been based at Lincoln, and the local record offices were offered the standard valuation register that has one line for each hereditament. And as I understand it, the fuller documentation was retained, but maybe not completely, maybe only as samples, I don't know, by TNA. So it would need work at TNA to do that, and I have not been sufficiently interested in any particular sites to do that myself.
Okay. Well, TNA, if it's got all of them, certainly it has for my area, it's 4 pages per reference number, which gives you a huge amount of background information and opportunity for many hours of research, I'm sure.
I think Richard's about to say that he's been delving in these.
Yes, take it away.
The class which Jonathan refers to at TNA with 4 pages per hereditament is class IR 58. And it is indeed potentially a very valuable source of information. But there is a quite significant caveat I discovered when investigating the premises occupied by one of my great-grandfathers in King's Lynn at the time when the valuation was being made. And that is that a quite large site was all lumped in, and there is practically no description of the individual building he was living in, which could have been useful to back up my father's memories of the place. Equally, my other great-grandfather in King's Lynn owned his own premises, and IR 58 is quite useful in distinguishing between premises which are owner occupied and premises which are likely to be rented. And my other grandfather's premises are described in slightly more detail, but still not in completely useful detail. And it's worth noticing in these areas in King's Lynn, where the central area evidently hadn't undergone very much redevelopment by 1910, the 1 to 500 was used. One other point which was raised as regards the wasted year, it's worth pointing out that once the dust had died down from the OS's exertion to provide necessary data for the Land Valuation Office, it set about carrying out pucker revisions over limited areas, and there are a number of these which were made around 1913, 14, 15. For example, Taunton, which was the first one that came to my notice. There also Norwich, and quite large amounts in the Manchester area, some of which have recently been reissued by Alan Godfrey in his series. This programme was curtailed by the First World War, but in all 3 instances, which I've cited, Taunton, Norwich and Manchester, the areas weren't due for revision under the OS's 20-year cycle for 1 to 500 revision for another 8 to 10 years or so. So, and indeed, in a report, I think of 1913, 1914, one of the annual reports suggests that the rigid 20-year cycle would probably need amendment in some way, possibly to one of 10 years for urban areas and 30 years for rural areas. So the whole land valuation episode is interesting as being the first stage in the evolution of the Ordnance Survey's continuous revision, rather than start at one end and finish at the other, cyclic revision.
With regard to owner occupation status, the single line valuation registers are also a source for that because they have owners and occupiers.
Yes. Yeah, I think the IR 58 tend to concentrate rather more on the owners.
Gosh, more and more aspects to this coming forward, aren't there?